Hi everyone, my name is Abby Newman. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies. Sorry I couldn't be here with you this morning. You met my colleague Kanu. I hope you are still feeling great today. I know everyone's energy's up, and I didn't get to do this earlier, but thank you all for being here. I am thrilled right now to introduce our next presenter, Nahal Toosi, who also goes by Halley, who is a reporter with Politico, and she writes about foreign policy and national security. And before joining Politico, she spent 8 years as a reporter and editor for the Associated Press in New York, Islamabad, Kabul, and London. Halley has always had a strong interest in migration and refugee issues and has written on Hmong refugees, the human displacement caused by militancy in Pakistan, and the policy and political challenges posed to the United States by the global migration crisis. And I have to say, I have to give a shout out, there's more information about Nahal, but you worked for my hometown newspaper, the Milwaukee Sentinel. Shout out to Milwaukee. We'll talk more about that. But right now we're talking about
Milwaukee is like Chicago, but just easier. That's seriously.
easier.
It's just easier.
I agree. I grew up there, so we'll definitely chat more about that. But now to get back to the serious and important issue, we'll get back to the topic at hand, and we're very fortunate to have Nahal here today to speak with us on the Rohingya crisis. Thank you.
So thank you guys so much, first of all, for having me. It's an honor. And actually, there's so many of you, and I thought it was going to be like a small group, so I'm a little nervous. But I'm actually kind of excited that you guys are all teachers, because I'm going to kind of pretend that you are my teachers from when I went to school. And there's some things I want to get off my chest, right? So, like, I'll just say this at the outset. Like, I don't know anything that happened after World War II. Why? Because our history class went chronologically, and we ended at World War II. I mean, it's been so frustrating through my professional career, where, like, you know, Vietnam is so much more relevant in a way to our generation, and yet I was never taught about it. So there's a lot that I've had to learn just being, since I've left school. Another thing was, I'm never going to forget the day in world history where we literally skipped Asia. It was like, we were like on page 150, and Coach Pack, our teacher, who I love, you know, but he's like, all right, going to page 250. And I'm like, but that's Asia. Are we skipping Asia? We were skipping Asia. That is, and then the other thing is, as much as I loved calculus, that's a lie, I didn't love calculus, but as much as I did well at calculus, I have never used calculus in my entire life. And I am really frustrated that instead of taking calculus and Algebra 2, another totally useless class, I didn't take statistics, probability, data analysis, stuff that I actually have found very, very useful. That's not to say there are not people who don't use calculus, but most people don't. So now that I've got that off my chest, let me tell you guys a little bit about the project that I worked on and some of the things I learned along the way. Because to be honest, this project really was an education for me. So I've covered foreign policy for a long time, but as you know, the reality is in US media, when we say foreign policy coverage, we're usually talking about the Middle East, maybe some parts of Asia, and Europe, right? Large parts of the world don't get the kind of attention, and certainly not Latin America, you know, that in our media coverage that they deserve it, and they should get more attention. But for me, I've always been kind of a Middle East, South Asia type. And so in early September, a source of mine contacted me and was like, meet me at the Starbucks, you know, at Van Ness. And I was like, okay, fine, what could this possibly be? You know, and I get there, and he's like, you have to write about this. You have to write about what's happening to the Rohingya. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I have no idea. And so he tells me a little bit. He says that, look, this is the Rohingya, these people are being killed and pushed out of Myanmar, which is also known as Burma, and I'm going to use those words interchangeably. And you know, they're streaming over into Bangladesh, and this is a huge, huge atrocity. It's a genocide. I mean, he was saying all these things, and I was thinking, well, this is terrible. Of course, this is. But then I thought, well, I write for Politico, right? I was like, how is this a Politico story? And this is something else you guys have to understand about the media is many of us work for particular publications that focus on one thing more than another, right? So for us, we cover a lot of different issues at Politico, but it's always through the political lens, right? So I was like, well, there's terrible things happening everywhere, so how do I make it relevant to my readers? And he pointed something out, the sources, which is the Trump administration has said virtually nothing about this. So it's an ongoing genocide, in his opinion, and they've said nothing. So I was like, aha, I have my angle, right? So I pursued the story, wrote it up, and it turned out to be really, really fascinating. There was this group of people known as Rohingya. They are a Muslim minority in Burma. There were about 1 million of them in Burma. And for many, many decades, they have been persecuted, prosecuted, marginalized, you name it, discriminated against. And there was a small Rohingya insurgent group that had attacked a set of military units or a bunch of border posts. And as a result, in late August of last year, nearly a year ago, the military of Burma reacted with disproportionate force. We're talking rapes, throwing babies into fires, literally, just all sorts of slaughter. I mean, you can't even imagine. It was really, really astonishing. And you know, so this was just and you're thinking, well, why would they do this? What's going on? Well, I had the opportunity, thanks to the Pulitzer Center, to go further into this story and learn a bit more about really what led to this. And as you guys, you know, listen to me, I want you to think about some of the lessons that you would learn, you would tell your students about how to go into a project, right? For me, when I said it's an education, I really meant it. I didn't know hardly anything about Burma or the Rohingya. So when the magazine editors came to me and said, do you want to do a big project about this? I was like, well, sure. And for us, it was very, it wasn't a normal type of thing because we don't, again, like I said, we like to have the political angle. But my editors were like, well, the Pulitzer Center is willing to fund this. And what we think is interesting for our readers is, how did the US miss this? How did the US not see this coming, okay? And I was like, okay. And in a way, I was really perfectly situated to cover this because a lot of what had happened between the US and Burma over the previous decade had happened during the Obama administration, and I knew a lot of people in the Obama administration. And at the same time, I'm interested in migration issues. So, you know, these things it was good for me to do. I was a good person to do it, but again, I was really a blank slate. So I went into this thinking, okay, well, this is really obvious, right? Good guys, bad guys, the guys who commit genocide, the poor victims, and the U.S. that was ignorant and didn't do anything. I thought I understood it all, right? But it was way, way, way more complicated than that. By like the second or third week, as I was researching and talking to people, having some conversations that were really terrifying because they were talking about things that I was like, I had to pretend I knew what they were talking about, but I didn't. I was like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? So then I realized one thing I had to do was to create a timeline of everything that had happened, okay? Because in a way, I was writing two stories. One was about what had happened to the Rohingya, and one was about the politics in Washington, D.C., and how this issue had been missed as the United States had engaged in a rapprochement with Burma. And so it was like two stories, and I had to fuse them, and so basically I started creating a timeline. And it was like, okay, this happened here, this happened here, this happened here, all these things together. And pretty soon, something very clear emerged, which is, at the same time that the United States, under the Obama administration, started to open up diplomatic relations with Burma, a country that the US had long shunned. I mean, Burma used to have more sanctions on it than North Korea, okay? At the same time that these things were getting so much better, our relationship with the Burmese was getting better, the Rohingya's life was getting worse and worse and worse. It was like you could chart it, and it was astonishing. So let me tell you a little bit about the US relationship with Burma, and a little bit more about the Rohingya. I'm sorry I get so thirsty. So Obama came to office with this theory, right? Oh, can I just, one more thing I wanted to say. I think this is really funny because nobody mentioned politics on this list of the stories you guys look for. Do you guys really not read politics?
We get it without answering it.
I was like, wait, come on. So going on this, so when President Obama took office, he had this theory. He was like, and he said this in his inauguration speech, he said, we're going to reach out our hand to our adversaries if they don't respond with a fist, right? And so he thought, this was his theory, we could make adversaries change their behavior if we just talk to them. He applied it to Cuba, he applied it to Iran, and he applied it to Burma. And the thing about Burma was that just as Obama took office, the military junta that ran Burma for so many years was deciding that it too wanted to have a different kind of country, right? They were heavily sanctioned, et cetera. The military people were fine, but the ordinary people were suffering. And they were a little bit tired of having China like loom over them and tell them everything. They wanted to open up to the West. They wanted their country to be to not be as far behind as it was. So they reached out to the Obama administration too. And so you had this perfect thing where you had a country of 56 million people and the general saying, we want to try democracy. And what was amazing was a lot of really incredible things happened during those few years. And this is a story that did not get the attention that it deserves, but the attention that it did get missed some important things. So the military, they eased off. They started letting people use the internet. They started allowing people to be able to buy cell phones. They allowed unions to form. They allowed people to go on strike even. People were suddenly, it was like opening up a new world for the vast majority of the people in Burma. And the Obama administration was like, okay, every time you guys do something, we'll do something for you, all right? So when, some of the things that the administration did was they sent an ambassador to Burma. They opened up a USAID mission to Burma. And they started lifting the long-standing US sanctions on Burma, okay? And this was Exhibit A of the Obama administration's example of how if you engage an adversary, it'll work out, things will get better, democracy will flourish, and everything will be fine. But the thing about Burma that probably deserved a lot more attention was it's not really a very unified country. There's many, many ethnic groups within the country. There's a long-running civil war among many of these ethnic groups. And to say that it's a unified country is really just not accurate. So even though they were doing all these things on the surface, freeing Aung San Suu Kyi, the famous pro-democracy activist, who is now basically the civilian leader of the country, they were not resolving all of their internal tensions. And then there was the Rohingya, who even among the ethnic groups were particularly vulnerable. This is one group that they don't have an army to protect them. They have, over a series of decades, lost tremendous number of rights. They were stripped of their citizenship in 1982. And they have just seen their fortunes go worse and worse and worse, and they really had no way to defend themselves against the Myanmar army. So on the one hand, like I said earlier, you're seeing this improvement in the relationship, and yet things are getting worse and worse for the Burmese. So when I was writing this article, the question that I kept asking people in the Obama administration was, why didn't you make this group of people a deal breaker? Why didn't you say, if you don't stop messing with these people, the deal is off. We're going to reimpose sanctions. We're going to withdraw our ambassador. We're going to cut off connections. And the reality is, honestly, they didn't really have a very good answer for me. The only answer, the most honest of the Obama administration officials were willing to say was, well, it wasn't just about this one group. It was about 55 million other people whose lives were getting better. So my story, and I hope you guys do take time to read it. It's 9,000 words, but it's pretty good, and that timeline is in there. What was really, it was the hardest story I've ever had to write. And it was partly because, like I said, when I walked in, I thought, good guys, bad guys, you know. And then after talking to everybody, I was like, I don't know what I would have done differently. I don't know. I don't know if there's any way that you could have prevented this one group from getting hurt the way that they've been hurt. During the same years that the US relationship was improving, the Rohingya saw multiple rounds of violence against them. In one instance, 86,000 of them were displaced. 120,000 of them were put in camps that many would argue are simply concentration camps. The UN visited one of these camps last year, and they said parts of it were, quote, literally cesspools. Like, it was really, really bad. They were not allowed to be counted in the census. There was a series of laws that were passed against the Rohingya, regulating their marriage, their childbirth, all sorts of things. And there was, and ultimately they were stripped of their right to vote, which was basically the last political right that they had. So there's a lot to the story. You can talk about Aung San Suu Kyi, you can talk about what really leads to this hatred of this particular group. I think it's a combination of Buddhist supremacism, which I didn't know was a thing until I was doing this story, racism, bigotry, and also just the military government's willingness to exploit divisions and to create an other so as to unify the rest of the country. And one of the most fascinating things was there's not even an agreed upon history of the Rohingya. A lot of people won't even, and one big thing is they don't like, the majority of the Buddhists don't even like the word Rohingya. If you use the word Rohingya, they're like, no, that's not a real people. That's not a real thing. So as a journalist and as a person who was trying to learn, it was one of those stories that really shattered a lot of stereotypes for me. And that's one of the things that I hope that when you guys talk to your students or bring projects in front of them to look at is to use examples that are not necessarily black and white and which do go against the stereotypes that are in their minds. Because this story certainly was for me. And part of the reason that I think this story was really important to do, and it's an important issue to talk about in classrooms, is because the migration crisis is not just about the Rohingya, right? So right now you have about 700,000 Rohingya who left since August to go into Bangladesh. And in Bangladesh, they're not recognized as citizens either. They're not even technically recognized as refugees in Bangladesh. They don't want to go back to Burma because they're afraid they'll be killed. And there's already like 400,000 of them in Bangladesh from previous rounds of violence against them. So you have this stateless group of people, basically indefinitely in Bangladesh, where they're not really wanted, but they're just one group of the many, many displaced people around the world. The other day, the UN came out with the new statistics. 69 million people displaced around the world. Many of them are internally displaced in their countries, but others are refugees who have had to go to other countries. And I looked this up, and that is more people than live in Britain, than live in France, and I'm pretty sure Italy, if I remember correctly, and many other countries. It's a whole group of people. And one of the things that if I had a bunch of students here that I would explain to them is, this is not a problem that I think is going to go away anytime soon. I actually think it's going to get worse. Climate change is a really good reason to think about because that's going to drive population displacement in the future for sure. And I also think that, in a way, the fact that the internet has brought the world together in so many ways and connected the world, it's also led people to realize what they don't have. And it's spurring many of them to leave and go to a place where they think that they can get it. So I think some of these migrants, perhaps who are in Europe, many of them, they probably were not facing political persecution where they came from. Not all of them. Many of them did, but I mean, some of them did not. But they saw, like they asked themselves, how come I don't get to have that good a life? Why do I have to be stuck here? And so I think in the future, you're going to see a world where the borders, they're less and less meaningful. And I think I just think this is going to be one of those issues that is going to vex our children and our grandchildren, because how do you deal with something like this, especially in a world where resources are not infinite? And if I was teaching about this in class, this is the one thing I kind of am frustrated with myself about, is I can't come up with a solution to this particular crisis. Well, I have one solution, but it requires $100 billion. This is the only solution I've been able to come up with, honestly. Like, sorry I'm drinking so much, but I need $100 billion. I've even asked, like last time I was in Chicago doing one of these things, we went to a financial services firm, and I asked them this. I was like, can I have $100 billion? And I would go to Bangladesh, and I would say, I will give you $100 billion if you make all these Rohingyas your citizens, treat them equally, and I will give you this money with strict anti-corruption mechanisms, to improve your economy, to fix your infrastructure, to deal with the overpopulation problem, family planning, that sort of thing probably would have to be part of it. And basically, I'd have to bribe the country, a poor country, to take these people. Now, that would lead to all sorts of other issues, or do you want to set a precedent like that? But again, it's one of those things where, I can't seem to come up with decent solutions, and frankly, I haven't seen a lot of grown-ups come up with any either. The US right now is not being helpful on this front, in terms of the global migration crisis. So if any of you ever have a chance to teach this stuff in your schools, ask the kids to come up with the answer. I want to know how they would solve this problem. And that's one thing that I think, again, I'm going to pretend you guys are my teachers again. It's I wish you guys had taught me more about current events. I really wish I knew more about current events. I wish you had made me deal with case studies of real issues so that I could have a real life application to all of these random things you're teaching me. And I wish that you had taught me how to solve problems better, actual real life problems, not math problems, actual real life problems. And so you guys have this opportunity, I hope, to get your kids and be like, how do you solve this problem? And look, if they don't come up with the answer, please don't fail them, because you'd have to fail the entire United Nations, okay? But I think people are really, really increasingly desperate for creative ideas as to how to fix the migration problem. And I hope that is something you guys employ in your teaching. So I'm going to stop there, partly because I'm having a hard time. But how much time do we have for questions?
We have about 30 minutes.
Okay, so plenty of time, and we don't even need to take up all the time. But please ask me anything. Really, I can get more into depth into this if you want. I just wasn't sure. Yes?
I found it interesting that you said that the Buddhist elite had an issue with your using the term Rohingya.
Yeah.
There are terms like that the U.S. press is okay using, but people elsewhere have a problem with. But there are actually freighted terms that the corporate media in this country aren't comfortable using. I lived in the Middle East, so there are things that we can say and can't say. So I prefer to teach journalism than do it, because there you can actually tell the students how to be critical consumers of certain stories. And so I'm just wondering if you ran into anything with your editors where there was a limit to what you were permitted to say, and your terminology was trusted, you're the reporter, you're the expert.
Yeah, no, in fact, they were very open. I would say the only thing that kind of annoyed me was I wanted to have my story include more of what the Myanmar ambassador told me. But for some reason, my editors cut that down quite a bit. And I'd never written a magazine story before, so I was kind of I wasn't in a position to be oh, you have to do what I say. It's okay, yes, Mr. Magazine Editor. But I think you're so right about the terms, and I'll give you an example. So the Myanmar ambassador to the United States agreed to meet with me for this story. And whenever I used the word Rohingya, he would be like, no, that is not a real thing. That is a word with no culture, no history, no background. And I was like, what are you, dude? And then one of the things that really struck me about it was almost near the beginning of the interview with him, he asked me, what is your nationality? And I was like, I'm American. Like, what's your problem, But anyway, then we had a good conversation. And then, I wasn't gonna lose the interview at that moment. But then at the end of it, I was like, so why did you ask me my nationality? And he goes, well, you have a Muslim name. And so I'm sure you'll be biased against us. And I was like, well, first of all, I'm not Muslim. It's not a Muslim name. And that's ridiculous. You need to open your mind a little bit. But I just was like, my God, why is he so obsessed? And then as I learned more about Burma, this is a country that tries to categorize all of the people within it. They have 135 recognized ethnic groups in Burma. The Rohingya are not one of them, okay? And what's funny is, so when I was trying to write the story, this was one of the things, I was like, 135 recognized ethnic groups. And I looked at it up again, and I was like, some places they had it as 135 races, 135 national races, 135 sub-ethnic groups. I was like, what is this 135? So I reached out to the International Crisis Group's Myanmar expert, and I was like, Richard, dude, what is the 135? What does it actually refer to? Is it races, ethnicity? What is it? And he goes, it actually translates into 135 types of people. Yeah. So I was like, and he goes, just say ethnic groups, you're fine. But that's how they think. They thought they categorized all the people in their country. And apparently the Rohingya were not one of them. So yeah. Yes?
I was in Malaysia last December and had an opportunity to sit very quickly at a table with the Prime Minister. And at the time, they were contributing they were contributing funds to a refugee camp. And I can't remember exactly where it was, but were you in your reporting, were you seeing this happening from other predominantly Muslim countries, contributing to camps?
Oh yeah. So this is one of my favorite things. The camps are funded in multiple streams. The United Nations tends to kind of run the pot. So a lot of people pay through the UN. The US is probably the biggest donor, even under Trump. They've been giving at least $300 million now toward humanitarian aid for the refugees. Again, this is not something that solves the problem, right? But, people aren't starving. But yeah, Muslim countries in particular were very keen on making this an issue. They're standing up for their Muslim brethren, the Rohingya. I know some of them had never even heard of these people before. I was talking to an ambassador from an Arab country who told me that my story was the first time he'd heard of these Rohingya brethren of his, but whatever. And some of them, the US doesn't actually like to advertise the work that it does or the money that's spent in some of these places because there's anti-US sentiment. So I actually don't think that's the case with the Rohingya, but generally speaking, the US is very careful about its branding on the aid it gives wherever it is, especially in Pakistan, because that, if you put, from the US, somebody will set it on fire. So, you have to be careful. But I did notice that Iran had labels here and there to our beloved Muslim brothers, the Rohingya, from the people of Iran. And that was just absolutely fascinating. But yeah, Muslim countries definitely have made this a cause, and so have, frankly, Islamist terrorist groups. The Rohingya crisis has given them something else to latch on, although it's weird because now it's against the Buddhists as opposed to Christians, but whatever. They'll take what they can get. The Rohingya themselves they're conservative, but they're not a radicalized population, not yet. But you have a camp of more than 1 million people right now, more than half of which are children, I should add, with no future, no prospects, no money. Are they going to become radicalized in the future? Well, I can assure you, I know because I saw them, you have these extremist Islamists in these camps recruiting now. Yes?
What do you know about the people that, the Rohingya people themselves? What's the history? I don't know anything about them.
So I'll tell you what I know. It's not nearly as much as I would like. Some of it's disputed. The Rohingya, as a term, did a really get used until like recent decades, right? But the Rohingya people are basically people of Muslim and Bengali descent who have roots in that part of Burma stretching back centuries. So that particular area in Burma is known as Rakhine State. This is where most of the Rohingya are. It used to be its own kingdom, right? So back, and it's like right on the water, and so it was kind of a crossroads for a lot of traders. So people would come from all over, and many of the Muslims ended up settling there. So over the generations, they just kind of became, you know, the Muslims of Rakhine, or Arakan, the kingdom, and then Rakhine State. Then the colonial era came, and this is my favorite thing because we can blame everything on the British. So this is the best part. So Burma, the kingdom of Burma, basically takes over the kingdom of Arakan, right? Then the British colonized both Burma and what was then Greater India, which included what is now Bangladesh. So the British see all this and they're like, this is all our territory, and they encourage people from what is now Bangladesh to go to what is now Burma and migrate there. This is like in the 1700s, 1800s. So along with the Muslims who were already there, you had these people coming in from what is now Bangladesh, but what to the British was internal migration, and they, fuse into a Muslim, darker-skinned community over time. And for the Burmese, though, they didn't see it as internal migration. These were like illegal immigrants, right? Illegal Bengali immigrants. So look, again, the Rohingya, over time, they began to call themselves the Rohingya. The more there has been pressure brought on them from the Buddhist majority, the more they have clung to the label Rohingya. This has not made them want to give it up. And frankly, like, if a community wants to call itself something, it generally speaking has the right to do that. But no, I mean, for the Burmese, like, even though these people used to have citizenship until 82, they see the history and they're like, well, if you weren't here before 1824, we're not sure what we'll do. We may recognize you, we may not. But if you came in after that, you're an illegal migrant. And of course, nobody's even that old anymore. So that's kind of part of the history.
Is it so weird that the Buddhist majority has that kind of...
So, okay, I'm not like an expert on Buddhism, but one of the things I found out, which I didn't know, again, like, it's one of those things where, like, I'm like, oh, I should have known this, but I didn't. So Buddhism has different factions or sects within it as well, right? And the Burmese, so again, the Bamar, also known as Burmen, are the majority in Burma. They are Bamar Buddhists. It's a type of Buddhism known as Theravada Buddhism, and they kind of see themselves as the best Buddhists. So there's a certain sense of superiority. Like, they don't even think the Dalai Lama is like good enough for their Buddhism, that sort of thing. So they have the sense of, supremacy, and they kind of fuse that into much of what they do. And part of it is that Islam has, over the centuries, gained so much traction in that region that they feel like they are like a bastion of Buddhism, and they really, really worry. Like, one of their big concerns is, oh my God, the Rohingya, they have so many children, they're gonna try to outgrow us, they're worried about the demography, that sort of thing. But then they impose like these weird things. They impose all these like they won't let them obtain certain kinds of schooling. They do all these restrictions that actually ultimately make the Rohingya less educated and less likely to get birth control, therefore more likely to reproduce. It just, they're causing themselves like this vicious cycle of issues. So yeah, I mean, that's the thing about the Buddhist thing. There's just this weird sense of superiority. And look, I would like to say, I mean, I'm sure that not every Burman Buddhist feels this way, or I'm sure that there's plenty who would want to help. But the reality is that, like, under the Obama administration, when the Rohingya, because the Obama administration didn't ignore the Rohingya problem, they just didn't make it like I said, a deal breaker. But one thing they tried to do was they were like, okay, we're going to go and we're going to talk to people in Burma, and we're going to get leaders of people in Burma to speak up for the Rohingya. They couldn't find anyone willing to do it. That included Aung San Suu Kyi, her followers, these people who had been political prisoners, right, who the US had helped get free, And they went to these people, these democracy lovers, these people who supposedly believe in human rights, civil liberties, blah, blah, blah. And they were like, will you please speak out to help the Rohingya, to protect them? No way, they're terrorists. They're dirty. Those aren't our people. Now, Suu Kyi herself, she doesn't like the word Rohingya. She's careful about what she says, but she's really not been helpful. Yes?
Why do you feel that we have to solve this problem? And why do you feel so frustrated that you can't come up with a solution? Well, we have the same problem here. Maybe if we solve our own problem, we'll be a good example to the rest of the world.
Well, I think, in terms of the different types of refugee challenges around the world, this is a particularly intractable one. So if you can solve this one, I think you can probably solve a lot of the others. That's one thing. I mean, say for instance the Syrian refugee problem, right? This challenge, I'm not sure how many Syrians are displaced now. I think it's 7 million who are refugees. I could be wrong about that. But one huge advantage they have over the Rohingya is they are still Syrian citizens. They have citizenship somewhere. They have an identity. The Rohingya are stateless. Nobody wants them. And so I'm not saying don't solve any other ones, but this is one of those where I feel like if you can figure this out, then maybe you can come up with a template or a formula that you can apply to other migration crises. Because there's going to be so many of them. I don't remember.
Could you compare them to the Kurds?
Kurds? The Kurds are not refugees.
The Kurds have their own
stateless.
territory.
No, they don't. They're stateless.
No, but
They're in several different countries.
they're not stateless. They are Iraqis.
Or they are Iranians. Or they are no. They have nationalities. But they want their own state. They want to have a Kurdistan. But they're not a stateless group. That's different. You can be an Iranian Kurd. They're an ethnicity that's spread over multiple countries. But they have that nationality for each country. But what they would like to do is have their own country. And those other countries are like, no, because we're not going to give up our territory. And frankly, the Kurds, Iranian Kurds don't necessarily get along with Turkish Kurds, who don't necessarily get along with the Iraqi Kurds.
Okay, I understand the distinction. Well then, what about the issue of feeling a need to solve the problem? Because I don't think that helps you think about the situation. I think you have to do what you're doing, and that is give us the history, the timeline,
Well, yeah, and I
and
think,
maybe not even to us.
no, I think journalistically,
Or we to go in over there and say,
well, no,
we
I'll
need to
tell
solve
you.
this problem.
Look, journalistically, I didn't really get into what I felt or anything. I mean, it's really not.
I know, but you're giving us.
But I'm personally,
No, but it's because it's just my personality. If I see something and I'm like, well, I want to fix it, or I want to figure out how to solve it. It's like a puzzle to me. So that's just me. It's not like every journalist feels a need to solve it. But I will say that I will say this. Look, you guys can look at these pictures all you want, right? And please Google me, Nahal Toosi genocide. The story will come up. You'll see a lot of photos by this amazing photographer, Shimon Berilsky. You can look at it all you want, but you cannot understand what it is like until you're there, okay? Because the visuals are nothing. When you're there and everything stinks because there's feces everywhere, and it's hot as hell in December, and there's dust all over you, and there's so much noise because there's so many kids, and you cannot think, and there's no privacy. And when you're there, and you see this, and you ask yourself, how the hell can anybody survive here? You will start to ask yourself, how can this be solved? It's just, that was a human thing. Maybe not a journalistic thing, but a human thing for me.
We also have the genocide conventions, which we are signatories. So we have, if we see genocide, we are obligated to.
And that's what I'm questioning, the wisdom
So let me-
of that
you bring up a
simplistic
really good
approach.
point.
Well, I think that this, it hasn't been labeled genocide for exactly that reason.
Right.
No, you're right.
So the problem is massive and it exists in lots of places. And it will always and continue to exist until people act.
So you're really point, which is the concept of genocide here. My editor put the headline on it, "The Genocide the U.S. Didn't See Coming." You know, I don't have anything to do with that. But technically, nobody's declared this a genocide yet. Nobody official, no government. But starting in like 2013, 2014, this was still under the Obama administration. This was before this spasm of violence last year. There were independent researchers who were looking into what was happening to these people, and they say, "Guys, we think this is a genocide." There's like 10 stages of genocide by some measures. And in 2015, there was a group that said, "Guys, these people are in the final stages of genocide." And the Obama administration, they didn't bite. Now, to this day, the U.S. has done is say this is ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is a term people came up with after the genocide laws were agreed to, because they never wanted to call anything a genocide, because if they were to call it a genocide under international law, you'd have to intervene to stop it. So instead, because the U.S. didn't want to call it a genocide, they call it an ethnic cleansing, which means nothing because they don't have to do anything. They would just say, "This is bad, stop ethnically cleansing these people, but we're not going to call it a genocide," okay? The U.S. did call what ISIS was doing a genocide, right? But they did that knowing that we were already fighting ISIS. And that's an interesting point. But no, frankly, like, that's another aspect of the story that I found so fascinating, was the international legal aspect of it. The whole question, is this a genocide, is it not? What is a genocide? And you're right, the point of those agreements, international agreements about genocide, was to prevent this from happening, not being like, "Oh, guess what? That was a genocide."
But my point is, if it's because of an international convention, then it needs to be an international reaction.
To solve it?
I don't think it can be solved, and I think it really move useful thinking away from the issue by saying, "Oh, I can't come up with a solution."
Well, no, in theory, you have something called the United Nations. You have something called the Security Council. In theory, they should be able to do something. But in reality, China has a lot of economic interests in Burma, including in a kind state. It has no interest in seeing Burma punished for anything. It will stop anything that tries to go through the Security
And
Council.
a lot of Rohingya, they're nobodies in terms of
Join the club.
everybody in the world.
Join the club.
No, it's difficult. It's a difficult one.
But if I can just, just say that being here is exposure, okay? And I believe that the job of a journalist is to expose something. We as individuals make our own decisions, okay? But knowledge is power, okay? We as educators have to educate, okay? And where I go?
No. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, part of, like, when I was there, I was like, okay. And I would tell people, "Well, I'm really glad you told me your story. And the best thing I can do is to tell it to others." And that's what I try to do, is tell people. But, I got to tell you, it's kind of hard these days when people say things like fake news or whatever. Because I had people in Myanmar be like, "It's not real." It was like, "It's a fake genocide. It's not real." You got to remember, Myanmar, they started using the internet back when, like a few years ago, and most of them get most of their information via Facebook and social media. And so these people who are fanning hatred against the Rohingya includes monks, right, who are using Facebook and social media to fan hatred against the Rohingya. And here's one of the most fascinating parts of it. As I was talking to Obama administration officials, and it's in my story, they're like, "Yeah, so on the one hand, we were like, hey, Myanmar, become a democracy, allow free speech." So we couldn't tell them, "Hey, shut these monks up."
And we couldn't shut down the Radio Rwanda that was spewing hate and pick up your machetes and go and kill your neighbor, because that was a violation of our belief in freedom of speech as well. And then, of course, Clinton has reversed his position that was a mistake on us, right?
Yes. Have there been any examples of any Rohingya people getting citizenship anywhere?
Sure.
I mean, has this been featured anywhere? Are there any stories on this? It'd be interesting to see.
So the citizenship question is a complicated one. Okay, I mean it's not. It's like. Let me just leave it as being very complicated. But say there are like people who have become Rohingya refugees. Like I met people who are. Who've been in Bangladesh since 1990, and they have UN refugee cards because that group was recognized as refugees. If they were to get, for instance, accepted to the United States through the refugee resettlement program, within a year of getting here, they would become US citizens. It is possible to do that. It's just a question of what country wants to take these on. And the Rohingya, they have a pretty strong diaspora. So they are around the world, and they are pretty vocal, but sometimes they do themselves more damage than good, frankly, because they tend to exaggerate at times, and so they kind of hurt their own cause when some of these websites go overboard. It's another complicated story. But yes, sir.
I appreciate your coverage of this. I just had a point that I think kind of relates to all of us too, that we talk a lot about Islam and Muslims in these global studies classes, and there's just kind of a pronunciation thing that I didn't know if we're aware of, but I know I have a lot of Muslim students as well who could kind of either feel like they're perpetually talked about as either the victims of violence or the perpetrators of violence or something like that. But whenever we're talking about Muslim or Islam, it's always Muslim or Islam, and I don't really know where that comes from, because most of the Muslims that I know pronounce it like a soft S. And it's kind of like if someone was always pronouncing my name wrong, but I didn't know if they were doing it on purpose or not.
Yeah.
Just as kind of but it always seems different that the way that me and my family always say it one way is different than the way that everybody else says it every other way I hear it. And I don't know.
Well, I mean, that also kind of depends on the culture. I mean, some people say Ramazan, and others say Ramadan, and it just kind of depends on where you are even within the Muslim world. I do say this, I do have a rule, it's Iran, okay? It's not Iran. And I remember I tweeted a while back, I was like, if you don't know how to pronounce Iran right, you don't get to have an opinion on Iran.
I guess the only way I've heard it here in America is Muslim or Islam. So I don't know if that, especially if we're talking about these things, I think it would be appreciated just to kind of at least have an awareness of the different ways that it's pronounced.
You're just
usually
not-
when you hear it,
You're not old enough.
at least I would say in my family, the way they say it is Islam or Muslim with a soft S, not a Muslim but whenever someone says Muslim, I don't think that it's intended to be, but it just sounds a little antagonistic.
It's an old school spelling.
Right,
Yeah.
Right. But I think that just might help to be a little bit more inclusive. Consider that public pronunciation.
Thank you.
Yes.
We have about 2 more questions.
As a public school teacher, I'm not supposed to be political, but I'll code of ethics. So my question is, how do you deal with politics in the classroom without being political?
Gosh. I think you should just stick to the facts. I mean, as a reporter, I'm not supposed to be political either. As a mainstream media outlet. So I just facts. If you guys were checking my Twitter feed today, I was in this raging Twitter battle with a couple of members of the Obama administration about a particular issue about a visa program thing that they had done that basically laid the groundwork for some of what Trump has done with his travel ban. And I had to be so careful. I wasn't saying this is bad or you guys did the wrong thing, because I would be taking a side and being an advocate. But I was look, you did A, B, and C. That led to D. Don't pretend that you didn't do this. It's reality. So my answer is simply stick to the facts, show them both sides, or oftentimes there's more than 2 sides. That's another thing to teach your students. and just say, well, this happened, then this happened. I do think you have to be like careful when you cross into analysis.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
If they become political.
Well, but then you have to challenge them and be like, well, yeah, but what are your facts? What makes you think that? And frankly, you can have people who are on left and right on a particular issue having the same set of facts, coming up with a different analysis from each, and both being accurate and correct. That's the thing. You have to be really careful. I would say, I'm not a teacher, but like, if I was grading too, I would be super careful that like, I don't grade based on politics, but also based on just how well they did the work. So I don't know, as a journalist, I feel like that's a good trick. Last question, yes?
Well, somebody said that you have the right to your opinion, but not to your facts, right? I teach English social at a community college.
Can you speak up just a little?
Yeah, sorry, I'm having some health issues. I teach intro to social in a community college. So some of the things that I always challenge my students is to back their opinions with facts. Otherwise, I really don't care. Because when we start shaping policy based on our opinions, right? We're not solving any real issues, right? And I think that the lady over there asked, why not focus on the immigration issue here? Because I don't think it's a crisis. I think we have made it an issue. I mean, well, the center, the summer camps, is an issue, right? But the immigration problem, as the current administration has framed it, is not a problem, right?
In terms of the numbers and stuff,
Right,
it's like,
statistically speaking, and so when you show students that data, right, let's say data speaks for itself.
Right.
And so you stay away from politics and you're grounded in data and facts as much as you can.
I think you're right, but I think I spoke a little bit when I said it's not a problem, because here's the thing, like, you're right, in terms of like the past, in terms of the numbers of border crossings, the numbers of undocumented immigrants, all this stuff, you could say like we're actually in a pretty good position compared to the past.
Right.
It's not as much as it used to be, or as much as the president likes to pretend that it is. But, there are people in this country who believe that even these fewer number of undocumented immigrants are a problem.
Right.
And frankly, they have the right to that opinion, right? But you have to, but where I get frustrated is when they pretend the facts are different. And if so, they tell me there's 20 million undocumented immigrants and they're all criminals. No, okay? But if they were to say, okay, you're right, it's like 10 million now, and actually immigrants commit very low amounts of violence, but I still feel like they are not helpful to our economy, because of these 3 reasons, I'd be like, all right, that's fine. But yeah, I mean, I think the thing that worries me most now is just like, can they find the right facts, and that's a discussion for another time.
Right facts?
Mm-hmm. Well, the actual facts, because there's people like who manufacture.
You're always selecting, like, if you're saying, well, this happened then, and then this happened, and then, but there was stuff that happened before that too, so it depends on where you select your facts. And that's why we're in this situation of fake news.
No, that's part of it's true, but like, I understand your point, but what I mean is there are people out there who are literally peddling untrue statistics. And that, I mean, like, there's this, I'm not going to name the group, but yeah. I mean, there are just people who go on the air and say things that are literally, that you're like, that's not true. Yeah, lying, that thing, yeah. All right, thanks, guys.